Haven't always been this good for CSX or for the railroad industry. I started my career in 1977 with the chassis system in Baltimore, and a few years before that, in the mid-70s, about 21% of the rail miles in the country were operating in bankruptcy. The wreck of the Penn Central and the other bankrupt Northeast lines have been consolidated under government control in Conrail, and the railroads have been steadily losing market share for decades across the nation as the interstate highway system was basically taking our business from us. You may recall at that time, railroads were extensively regulated. Most of our commercial decisions were made after consultation with our ICC attorneys. Contracts with our customers were prohibited, and all pricing had to be processed through rate bureaus, which more often than not kept individual marketing initiatives at bay. And in my early years in the industry was earning about a 2% rate of return, not enough to remain viable, and certainly not enough to invest in our networks. The improvements began with the passage of the Staggers Act in the 80s, which partially deregulated the industry. We began to market our services, increasing our competitiveness, meeting customers' needs much better, and for the first time we could enter into contracts with our customers. As you know, a series of consolidations followed. In our case, large regional railroads like Chessie, L&N, Seaboard Coastline merged into the large Class I railroads of today. We shed duplicative routes and unproductive branch lines and dramatically improved our productivity, which allowed us to grow the volumes. And we mainly did that by passing those productivity savings along to our customers in the form of reduced rates. In that restructuring over those 15 years of followed Staggers resulted in a streamlined core railroad network with more manageable infrastructure requirements and really gave birth to a short line industry that I know you'll be hearing later today, which is much better suited to serving some of the local markets. And while the private railroad industry did survive, it really didn't prosper. Our earnings really couldn't cover the high cost of the capital investments we need to make on an ongoing basis. As you are well aware, industry-wide, railroad capital expenditures exceed 17% of revenues. That's more than 5 times what's required for the manufacturing industries, 50% greater than even the electrical utility industry. And it's not until the last 2 years that the American railroad industry has begun earning a large enough return to even begin to cover this cost of capital and to justify sustained investments in truly expanding the business. Today, though, growing demand and improving operations have created what we're calling a rail renaissance in America. Global economic and demographic trends are driving rapidly escalating demand for transportation by all modes. By 2020, port volumes are projected to double. Demand for electrical power is projected to grow by 30 to 50% in the next 2 decades. And our utility customers are looking to CSX to bring more fuel to new and expanding power plants. Growth in global trade, increased highway congestion, and truck driver shortages will drive growth in rail transportation. And while the government is supportive of the ever-increasing needs in our federal highway system, private capital investments in supporting is necessary to support much of the growing demand for rail transportation capacity. CSX is investing heavily in our 21,000-mile network, but private capital investment alone can't create enough capacity to move the trucks off the highway and meet the burgeoning future demands for freight transportation. So what is CSX doing to maintain our current network and prepare for the growing infrastructure needs of the next 20 years? First, we're investing in safety. In the past 2 years, we've spent more than $970 million on cross-tie and rail maintenance, installing more than 5 million new cross-ties and 700 miles of track. We've hired and trained 800 new maintenance-of-way employees, replacing attrition of 550 and adding 250 more track workers to our existing forces. Strategically, we're watching and studying population, production, and consumption trends both within our service territory and worldwide. CSX's network is to a very great extent a legacy of the first half of the 20th century. Our system was originally built to serve the population centers of the Northeast, the industries of the Midwest, and the rural Southeast. The populations and industries have moved. And by the year 2020, the states of Georgia and Florida will exceed the populations of New York and New Jersey, Auto manufacturers are citing new plants in southeastern states, and manufacturing centers are now often located overseas with their goods flowing from different directions. It's a tremendous challenge for us to keep up with demand that is both growing and shifting. Since the year 2000, we've invested $7.2 billion in capital in our company, replacing locomotives, cars, upgrading technology, and improving our network. In addition to maintaining and recapitalizing our current infrastructure, we've dedicated 18% of our 2006 capital spending to building capacity, which is a change from the past where we basically couldn't afford to do that. Our investment has enhanced our operations on the river line between Albany and New York City, as well as the corridor from Chicago into the southeast, serving such growing urban markets as Nashville, Birmingham, Jacksonville, and Atlanta. This expansion of capacity will position CSX to move more Powder River Basin and Illinois River Basin coal into the southeast, supporting electric reliability as utilities begin to resource from the traditional Appalachian coal fields. With the returns we've been able to earn in recent years, I fully expect CSX will continue to invest our retained earnings in our railroad, but frankly, I don't believe we'll be able to invest quickly enough to meet the marketplace demands for our service. Where public and private needs converge, CSX is already finding creative opportunities for partnerships with state and local governments. In Central Florida, CSX is working with the state to expand rail capacity for both freight and passengers using federal, state, and private funds. We have a vision for I-95 corridor of the future between Washington, D.C. and Miami that includes substantial growth of both passenger and freight service with a sealed high-speed passenger route. We hope this 1,200-mile corridor will serve as an example of how well-planned, comprehensive investment in rail infrastructure can support economic development and further national transportation goals. Our investments in CSX can't be just in track and throughput capacity. Today, we're investing in the environment, joining with the Environmental Protection Agency on SmartWay and Climate Leaders programs. New technology on our locomotives provides employees with tools they need to handle trains in the most fuel-efficient manner. It's not a coincidence that our company's record-setting infrastructure investments in 2006 and 2007 come at a time when we're just beginning to approach revenue adequacy. Unlike highways and waterways, private investment builds and maintains America's network. That investment, of course, requires strong earnings that must remain strong both to make the necessary money and to justify reinvestment in the railroad business. At CSX, we call that earning the right to spend. The railroads will need to achieve and sustain revenue adequacy if they're going to make the kind of investments necessary over the next 2 decades. Ill-considered calls to re-regulate the rail industry by whatever name are the greatest threat to the railroad industry's ability to reach sustained revenue adequacy and to continue reinvestment into the future. Failure to address these transportation capacity problems over the next 20 years threatens the ability of Americans' businesses to compete in the fast-changing global economy. Private investment in railroad infrastructure, unhampered by re-regulation and supported by an investment tax structure that rewards capacity expansion, is part of the solution. Investment in railroad capacity is smart public policy. Over long distances, rail saves money, cutting transportation costs for shippers and the prices of goods and services. Rail is more fuel efficient and more environmentally friendly. It's safer and offers relief to our overburdened interstate highway system without huge public expense or disruption of building additional lanes. So rail capacity and infrastructure needs are among the most important issues facing us today. Again, I thank the board for creating a forum to discuss these issues and ask for your support on the industry's current legislative agenda to create an infrastructure tax credit and to fight all attempts to impose regulations that will prohibit the industry's growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. Mr. Haverty?
Thank you very much, Chairman Nottingham, Vice Chairman Buttry, Commissioner Mulvey. It's certainly a pleasure to be here this morning, and we appreciate you having a hearing on rail capacity and infrastructure requirements for the railroad industry. I think that Kansas City Southern offers a unique perspective, because we're the smallest Class 1 railroad, we've gone from being a regional railroad to an international carrier, and we are the only railroad that actually has 100% ownership of a railroad in the United States and in Mexico.
Mr. Hammond, excuse me just a moment. I'm getting old and hard of hearing. Could you pull that mic a little closer up there? I don't know whether anybody else is having trouble hearing or not, but I see some heads nodding in the back there.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Is that better?
That's much better.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me step back here for a minute, back to 1995, when we were a regional railroad, and talk a little bit about the capital that we spent at that time. We were a regional railroad, as I said. We probably spent around $50 to $60 million a year just to keep the railroad safe and to operate efficiently. We did not have a lot of money, certainly, to spend on capacity improvements. If you step ahead now to where we are today, we've more than doubled in size. We're an international railroad, and we are, in fact, investing in 3 areas. We're looking at mainline capacity expansion, we're looking at terminal expansion, and we're bringing more and more equipment onto our railroad. And all of these things are related to increased demand that we are seeing. If you look at the slide that is here, I'm not going to go through all of these corridors in detail, only to show that we, between 2007 and 2010, will spend close to $500 million on capacity expansion in these 9 corridors, 6 in the United States and 3 in Mexico. And they range from putting in double track to siding extensions, and from Rosenberg to Victoria, Texas, building 90 miles of new railroad, putting in a signal system between Shreveport and Meridian. We're looking at putting in positive train control from Lázaro Cárdenas to Querétaro, and all of these are intended to enhance capacity. Also, we are looking at terminal improvements and expanding. We have 7 new intermodal terminals, or expanded intermodal terminals, that are on the drawing board today, 4 in the United States, 3 in Mexico. Plus, we have 2 switch yards, 1 in the United States and 1 in Mexico, that we will spend close to $250 million on between 2007 and 2010 to be able to handle increased demand. Locomotives are not infrastructure, but they help move the traffic. In the 3-year period from 06 to 08, we will have 270 new locomotives. We're bringing on 150 new locomotives in 2007. So when you look at our 2007 capital budget, we've got $270 million appropriated in the United States and Mexico. In addition to that, there's $125 million going in to the line between Shreveport and Meridian in conjunction with the joint venture with Norfolk Southern. And then we have 150 new locomotives coming on to the railroad that we will lease. The value of those is over $300 million. So leasing them is a financial decision. But when you put the pieces together and you think about what we're spending on capital, what we're spending on the joint venture and new locomotives, you're looking at around $700 million. So you step back to where we were 12 years ago at $50 to $60 million. We're 10 to 12 times more than what we were back at that time. And what we're doing is we're putting it into capacity expansion because of increased demand. Our growth corridors are shown here. I'm not going to go into those. I just want to emphasize there's not one single commodity that we're concentrating on to be able to improve the capacity. Our coal lines are important to us. Grain, carloads, which is chemical, and paper are very much important to us, and then intermodal and automotive. Why are we investing as much as we are in capacity? This is a very busy slide, but it shows you between 2007 and 2010 new facilities, or very significantly enhanced facilities, that will go in on our railroad in both the United States and Mexico. These range from a mini steel mill in Columbus, Mississippi, to a new GM plant at San Luis Potosí, a new Chrysler plant at Saltillo, Mexico, to ethanol plants and many other facilities. So this is the kind of demand that we're seeing, and I would tell you that the other railroads are seeing the same kind of demand as well. We think it's appropriate, certainly, for your agency to be looking at rail capacity and also to be thinking about it compared to what we see with trucks. We have an opportunity, I think, by enhancing rail capacity to reduce highway congestion, to improve energy efficiency, reduce pollution, improve safety, and invest public dollars in more productivity. What that means is converting trucks to rail intermodal. This just shows you where our corridors are that we are focusing on Kansas City Southern. And the next slide then just shows you again the new intermodal facilities between 2007 and 2010 that we intend to put on our railroad, and there are 7 of those. To wrap up here, I'd like to spend a little time on this slide here. I think that the STB should resist efforts to limit rail revenues, or as the Undersecretary referred to it, as rate regulation. I was one of those people that, in fact, was here prior to deregulation, maybe by a decade and a half, and I saw the railroad industry at that time and worked in it, and I understand it. And it was not a good feeling. We were an industry that was on the verge of nationalization, and a lot of people forget about that. We went into deregulation in '81. We started to control our costs, improve our service, and we literally, the industry, put billions and billions of dollars into infrastructure. And what happened? The rates went down, 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 and down. And they went down for almost over 20 years. And then we began to get more demand. And why did we get more demand? Because you have more Asian traffic. You have more trucks coming off the highway due to driver shortages and hours of service and things like that. And you also have fuel price increases. And you have more and more and more of a demand for rail service. So it's only natural that when you have that kind of demand, that prices are going to go up. So it's really the first time since deregulation in 1981, in the last 2 to 3 years, that I have seen prices go up. And I don't think people should be shocked by that. I mean, that's a market condition that happens in everybody's business. If you have significant demand, then the prices usually increase. Second bullet point there, we talked a little bit about the incentive tax credit. I certainly hope that this STB will support that. I think it would be something that would be good for the industry. There are some questions. I've heard some folks say, yeah, but it's going to help out this commodity, or it's going to help out that commodity, and it doesn't really help out my business. If you enhance capacity on a railroad to where you can become more fluid, it's going to help out everybody. And that's the way that needs to be looked at. And from a shipper standpoint, they also have the right, if they have facilities, chemical plants with storage yards, or utilities that want to increase the length of their tracks to handle bigger coal trains, they get the same incentive tax credit as well. We certainly believe in private-public partnerships. Some of those have already been named, but look at the Alameda Corridor out in California. Certainly was a great public-private type of venture. Create's been mentioned in Chicago. Right now, the railroads are talking with the city of New Orleans about making some enhancements there to move traffic through there following the Katrina that would be more efficient. And it just things like in Kansas City, flyovers where the Burlington Northern Santa Fe helped alleviate traffic congestion there. All of those things are public-private partnerships, and we would hope that the STB, in fact, does promote those. We're a great supporter of the RIV program, and I hope the STB will be as well. It's been used efficiently, and I think it can be used more efficiently in the future. We used it to rehabilitate our Tex-Mex line, put $50 million into it. It's a much safer, more efficient, higher speed line than it was in the past. And there's been some comments about safety, LUAC. We certainly hope that you will support that. There's $350 million authorized for funding for rail relocations and improvements, and clearly railroads get into situations that they were there many, many years ahead of a city, and then there's traffic congestion and so on. I think if there's going to be relocations and so on, that clearly is something that should have some public money go into it. There's no funds been appropriated yet at this point in time, and we would hope the STB would ask for that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you here today.
Thank you, Mr. Haverty. We'll now turn to Mr. Mormon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, Commissioner Mulvey. I also want to echo the thanks of my colleagues on the opportunity to appear before you today and talk about what I think is one of the most important issues facing our industry. And I am, I guess what I prefer to say rather than bringing up the rear is that I'm batting cleanup for the Class 1s. So I will just try to be brief and maybe recap some of the themes that you've already heard, because they are, as you can already see, common themes that you're hearing from all of us who are involved in the railroad industry. The railroads are growing in terms of both shipments and capacity, and that's after a long period of rationalization. And the important thing is that we must continue to grow and grow at even higher rates if this country is to avoid what many people describe as a looming transportation crisis. It's a phrase you hear more and more. You see more and more data to suggest that by the year 2020, there are parts of this nation's infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, will be at virtual gridlock if, in fact, the railroads are not able to take on more than, as was suggested earlier, just the continued growth of a steady rate of market share. So in the next few minutes, let me try to expand on that theme, on our current prospects, our future needs, and then maybe touch on the threats that I think exist today to what is essentially a good news story, not only for the railroad industry and for all of the people who are employed by the railroad industry, but I would argue also good news for our shippers and for our country. We all talked about volume growth, particularly since 2003. It's been, quite frankly, unprecedented. I won't belabor all the reasons why this growth has come on. We've all discussed them before. But the fact is, I think it's fair to say that it, to some extent, caught the industry off guard when it came on, particularly because for the past 30 years, we've been in a very slow growth environment, and we had survived, and to the extent which was not very great that we had prospered at all, we had largely prospered through rationalization. And you will have seen the prior slides about productivity since the passage of the Staggers Act. That was the result of a steady stream of technology improvements and of wringing capacity out of our systems in every possible way that we could. Along with the volume growth that we've seen in the past few years, as Mike Haverty alluded to, we have seen pricing power come back. And as you will undoubtedly hear later, and you have all heard before, that has created a great deal of angst with some of our customers. Customers who for 25 years or more were used to steady decreases in real terms in railroad rates. We've all looked at those charts before. My analogy to what railroad rates look like for the period following Staggers in real terms is they look like a ski slope down, and not the bunny slope either. Fortunately, we reached the bottom of that slope in about 2003, 2004, and I will tell you it was fortunate because this industry had come very close to squeezing most of the capacity out, most of what we perceived as the excess capacity. And as a result, when the volumes came on, we had essentially largely right-sized for what we thought the growth would be in the future. And when this growth came along, we all had to step up and start to invest more than we had in the past. Now, the good news is that as rates went up, our profitability went up. Did it go up to enormous levels? Absolutely not. When you look at our returns even today in 2006, we just moved out from the bottom quartile up to maybe close to midway. And as I always say, I don't ever want our profits to be excessive, but, you know, I'd like them to at least be like the children from Lake Wobegon, a little bit above average. They're not there yet. And not only are they not there yet, we've only had a couple of years of where we've even had a colorable argument that we're returning our cost of capital. 2 years does not a trend make. And it's been a long, long time in this industry since any company has had a sustained run of making its cost of capital. Even Norfolk Southern in the 90s, in the late 80s, only earned its cost of capital in 6 out of 10 years, and we were widely regarded, correctly regarded, as a very well-run company. So the good news is we're making more money, but the much better news for everyone is that we're all taking that money and turning around and reinvesting it in our properties. And you've seen and heard the numbers from everyone else. I'll just give you some quick bullets from Norfolk Southern. We tend to look at investment and capacity in 3 bullets, or in 3 buckets, I should say. The first, and maybe the most important, is people. And we and all the other Class 1s have been hiring at an unprecedented rate. We hired at Norfolk Southern 8,000 people in the last 4 years. Our, our net employment after attrition of both trainees and existing employees is up about 2,500 people. I can tell you that 10 or 15 years ago, if our employment had gone up by 2,500 people in a 3-year period, somebody would have had my head, because it was just not an environment which permitted that kind of investment in people. Second investment in capacity is in rolling stock and locomotives, and like everyone else, Norfolk Southern has been making substantial investments. We've bought 500 new locomotives in the last 4 years, and in addition to buying new locomotives, we've dramatically increased our overhaul programs, our running repair programs. Our goal is to have the best maintained locomotive fleet out there that we can, because a locomotive fleet that's not well maintained, power spends more time in the shop, it fails more on line of road, it creates more service problems, it creates more congestion. It's a vicious cycle, and we need to make sure that we don't get in that place. The third thing that we do is invest in infrastructure, and infrastructure not only means more sidings, more passing tracks, more double track, where we, along with everyone else, have invested, but more terminals, more things like intermodal terminals. And intermodal terminals are a big part of our capital program, and intermodal obviously is an important part of our growth story. How much are we investing? Well, from the capital side, between 2000 and 2006, we invested $6.3 billion in capital, and that compares with our total net income for the period of $5.2 billion. Our capital program this year is $1.35 billion. That's roughly equivalent to our net profit of 2006. So, as I say, we're spending the money that we're making on improving capacity and improving customer service, because that's what capacity ultimately leads to, is better customer service. Now, is that enough? A question you've asked. Well, it really isn't, in the sense of investing money for what needs to happen if we're to avoid that transportation crisis. And that's a fact that not only we believe that's realized, but it's a fact that's realized by more and more public entities as well. And so you have seen more and more interest in the rise of public-private partnerships. CREATE is certainly a good news story in that regard, although there's still a lot of work to be done. Another good news story for Norfolk Southern is the so-called Heartland Corridor. I think you'll hear a little bit more about that from the Virginia Ports Authority later. That's investing in a capacity in a different way. That's investing in a clearance project to clear tunnels and bridges to open up the shortest, best route for double stack traffic to move from the Port of Norfolk into the interior of the country. We got money from the TLU bill. Virginia's contributing, Ohio's contributing, and Norfolk Southern's putting in a substantial amount of money as well. The investment tax credit is another great mechanism to improve or accelerate the investment in infrastructure, and I would encourage everyone to get behind that. Why people won't, who are worried about the railroad business and railroad service, I quite frankly don't understand. Things are working well right now, and why would you want them to change? Well, I don't think you want them to change from a regulatory environment, but nonetheless, there are changes proposed out there by lots of different people. And so let me just close by asking you to ask the folks who come in and say, this system is broken and it's not working, how do they propose to fix it? We hear all the time from our customers that they want three things. They want more capacity, they want better service, and they want lower rates. And I don't know how you do all three of those. Maybe there's a plan out there we haven't heard. But as you hear people propose that, I would ask you to challenge them as to, okay, at the end of the day, how does that make our railroad system better? How do we add capacity in a regime that you might propose? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Warner. Thanks to the whole panel. We'll get into some questions now. Mr. Ward, thank you for being here. It's always good to hear about your Baltimore roots. You and I share that. I've got some deep family roots there, too. I hope you haven't given up on the Orioles.
No, I haven't. I still have that Baltimore accent, too.
Still only April, so we can't give up yet. Let me, first of all, commend the CSX for something that's not necessarily new, but it relates to capacity. And I think also it relates to, it's important to point out as we look at different, at least intellectually, different models, different approaches, and think about the role of the federal government. And I'm reflecting back to your post-Katrina, your railroads, and I know you're not unique. All three of our witnesses today played important roles in the post-Katrina hurricane recovery effort. I had a chance to spend a lot of time down with Secretary Mineta on the Gulf Coast, particularly walking and looking at what I was focused on at the time, which was the US 90 highway corridor of Mississippi, which was just devastated. The very large highway bridges over the Bay of St. Louis and the Bay of Biloxi. And we were working overtime, I can tell you, to get the, working with the state and the locals to get that large US 90 bridge over Biloxi Bay out for contract and rebuilt. And it kind of put us to shame to look over and see that the CSX bridge was up in what seemed like no time. It seemed like it was a matter of 2 or 3 months. And when I started asking about that in my previous capacity, it was obviously very clear to me that the shackles, the burdens that come with extensive federal oversight, which is the case in the federal highway model, literally, despite the best efforts in emergency conditions, were preventing smart, hardworking people, and there are a lot of them at the state and local level working this problem with us, from getting that highway bridge out for bid. You had your bridge not only out for bid, but constructed, reconstructed, and open to traffic before the highway community was able to actually issue and award bids to get the highway bridge. And I say that because there were reasons for that. And it really came down to the federal restrictions and regulations on the procurement process, on the environmental procedures that came along with strong federal oversight, a strong federal role. And so I'm a big believer that the strong federal role has been a net plus for the highway sector over the last 40, 50 years. But I just point that out as a, just watch out, watch what you ask for if anyone is asking for a super strong federal presence in the oversight of and funding of railroads, because it can come with some unexpected and unwanted repercussions. That's just one. But anyway, well done in getting that your infrastructure up and working.
Well, thank you. And I think that's an excellent point you raised, because we were able to do that in about 5.5 months, and I think that's a tribute to our engineering department. It's also a tribute to our fellow railroads, because we were able to continue to serve our customers. They let us route over their systems, so we continued the continuity of serving the customers that weren't disrupted by the hurricane. And I think your point on letting private industry decide when and how quickly they can do these investments is an excellent one. And that's why we think the idea of the investment tax credit is such a great one, because we all, each one of us, have projects we could probably justify if we had some incentive to do that. And we are probably best to judge where are those places to put that incremental capacity to help support the country.
Thank you, Mr. Mormon. Speaking of the investment tax credit, I've certainly been speaking out in support of that for some time now. I think it's very wise policy. I do have some concerns with the the sort of the scoring, the inside the Beltway, Washington, D.C. discussion of scoring, that somehow providing the investment tax credit to railroads and your customers and shippers would somehow be a net drain on the Treasury. And I encountered this in the highway world when we talked about and had to finally overcome years of fierce Treasury Department resistance to private activity bonds. That was a case where there was actually no market for private activity bonds in the highway sector, yet and so there was no pre-existing activity there, and Treasury would argue that providing that benefit would be a net drain. And that assumes, of course, that we have a very contained economy that's only domestic, and that all dollars end up flowing to the U.S. Treasury if they're not flowing somewhere else in the U.S. It doesn't always take into account the international financial markets that we operate in, the huge opportunities for funds from all over the world to come in to invest in our infrastructure. So let me get to the question. How can we get beyond that? Do you see the investment tax credit as somehow being a drain on the Treasury? I mean, is there a dynamic way to score that or look at that? If you look at jobs created and economic activity created by meeting the challenge we have, at least in part through that tax credit?
Well, I will have to admit to you that I have had the system of scoring explained to me, and it seemed fairly arcane, and not sure that I either comprehended it at the time. I'm certainly not sure I do now. But I think your point is a good one. The fact of the matter is that what we're talking about with the investment tax credit is a huge accelerator of investment in capacity in the railroad industry. And the way it's structured is that it is only for new capacity investment in the railroad industry. Are there benefits in terms of more job creation? Certainly there are. There's more economic activity associated with it. There's far more private investment as well, because although there's a tax credit, the bulk of the money is private money that flows in. And then downstream, there are enormous benefits that can be scored, I think, in some ways in terms of trucks that are taken off the highway, less need for highway maintenance, a reduction of stress on bridges, less need to add highway capacity, along with big environmental benefits in terms of lower fuel consumption, lower emissions, lower CO2 emissions as well. So if you look at it from a comprehensive standpoint, I think it's a no-brainer. Whether or not it gets bogged down in what as I say, I think is a fairly arcane method of looking inside the Beltway at dollars is another matter. If that were to happen, I think that would be a great tragedy for the country, because this investment tax credit makes such good sense for all of the reasons we've been talking about today.
Mr. Haverty, would you care to address that same question?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that drain the Treasury, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak on whether or not this would have a significant drain on the Treasury. I do think that when it comes to railroads, that there seems to be somewhat of a bias against using this type of incentive, and I'm not sure that I quite understand that. I know you come from the highway side, but I can remember a situation a few years ago in Kansas City where we were looking at putting in commuter rail service, and it was on a Burlington Northern line that went to Olathe, Kansas, and Matt Rose came up, and we actually came up with a plan of how we would do it, and it was going to cost maybe $100 and some million to get commuter service started. And everybody said, my God, we can't spend that kind of money. That's just outrageous. Yet, just down the highway, they were putting in a triangle down there that was the part of a highway system, and spending $500 million just on an interchange, highway interchange. Yet you can't spend $100 million where you can take thousands of vehicles off of the highway, and you can't build highway infrastructure for nearly what you can with railroad infrastructure. So I do think there is some bias and some bias here in Washington against using these tax credits. But I think if you want infrastructure growth, it's going to be good national transportation policy, again, for all the reasons I tried to articulate earlier of taking trucks off the highway, reduce pollution, and so on, then this type of thing needs to be thought about.
Mr. Ward, would you care to respond?
I don't have a lot to add. I think I agree pretty much with what Wick and Mike said. I guess I would just like to expand a little bit on the point that Mike Haverty made earlier, which is we do have some customers that say, gee, if I support this ITC, what's in it for me? And I don't know that it's always easy to point to a specific benefit for a given customer or industry. But again, as we make these investments to increase the overall fluidity and service for everybody, I think it can be beneficial. And as well, they are eligible for those credits as well.
That's a good point.
And my praise to Mr. Mormon's company as well, because they were able to jump in and assist the customers and the people of Louisiana and New Orleans in that effort. It was impressive, very impressive. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. One interesting note on that is, you know, many times people are not real fond of hearing the whistle on the trains blowing. But when we finally got back up in about 5.5 months, we actually ran, since the communications weren't great, we had these planes with the little flyers, trains are back. And people said they were very happy to hear the train whistles again because it was a sign of progress and recovery for the people down in that territory.
It was like seeing the contrails again after 9/11. You know, looking up in the sky and seeing those contrails that some people don't like to see. I frankly love them. The more I see, the better I like them. But in any case, moving on, the Meridian Speedway project, I think, was mentioned a minute ago. How's that going in terms of increasing rail capacity along the southern tier?
It's going very well. What we did, NS and KCS formed a joint venture between Shreveport and Meridian, and we own 70%, Kansas City Southern does, and NS owns 30%. And for that 30% investment, they put up $300 million, of which we committed to put $260 million into the railroad to improve infrastructure.